I actually came upon the idea for The Race for Paris when I was doing research for my first book. I read something in Margaret Bourke-White, the famous photojournalist, in her memoir, her autobiography, that made me, it was very moving. I don't want to say too much about what it is because it would spoil the plot, but it was very much about the intersection of motherhood and these women trying to do extraordinary things. And I thought I would like to explore that. And then, so I started reading about women journalists during the war. I had majored in history at Michigan, great education, a focus on 20th century American wars for my history degree. So it was a turf that I was really interested in to start with. And I started reading about women like Martha Gellhorn. You know, Martha.
Yeah, these are all real, very famous women photographers and women correspondents during that war.
That's exactly right. Martha Gellhorn, you know, we know her as Hemingway's third wife, Ernest Hemingway's third wife, but she was a war journalist in her own right and a fine novelist as well.
I didn't hear that. You mentioned three. Then you've got Lee Miller. She's the only one I never ever heard about.
Oh, that's interesting. Lee Miller, she photographed and wrote for Vogue. It's really interesting that Vogue had its own journalist during the war. Exactly. You know, Ladies' Home Journal had its own journalist during the war. It's I think it's a really fine indication of how immersed in the war the whole society was. But Lee Miller did some of the most incredible war photography and journalism of the war. One of the things she did was she was the first to document the use of napalm during the war. So one of her shots caught the use of what turned out to be napalm. She is probably best known for a picture taken of her. It's Lee Miller taking a bath in Hitler's bathtub in Munich, Germany, which is a lovely photo. But Lee Miller was a terrific journalist.
So how many years in research and where in research? I mean, certainly gave you a good excuse to go to Paris.
Twice.
But you did
for a month each time.
You had to go to libraries.
I did. You know, I literally started this novel before the turn of the century. So a long time ago, I've been working on it for a long time. When I started working on it, the internet was not as developed as it is now. And so I spent a lot of time in libraries in the early part, looking at a lot of books, reading a lot of material.
And you do at the end of this book, you meant in acknowledgments, you mentioned a lot of the stuff that you read.
Right. A lot of things now, and you know, kind of came online literally in the process of writing this novel. So, for example, now you can look at the New York Times archives online. You can pull up a particular day and see exactly what they were reporting. I had access to Ernie Pyle's reporting on the war, to Lee Miller's, not only her reporting, but also some earlier drafts of some of her work.
How did you get that, through the internet?
Different places. Different places. The Lee Miller earlier drafts are actually published in a book that, along with many of her war photographs. Martha Gellhorn's letters, which were a great source of some of the everyday details of being a journalist were published.
For instance, tell a couple of details. The fact that what these girls accomplished, still had to go back to London for approval in order to...
Right. The experience of male journalists and female journalists during the war were pretty dramatically different. The male journalists were assigned to, everybody was assigned to a military unit, and you were under the command of whoever was the commander of your military unit, and that commander got to decide what you got to do. The men were mostly housed at press camps where they had twice daily briefings about where the war was. They were given jeeps and all the resources they needed to go off and cover the war. They could come back or not in the evening. They could there were censors at the press camps where they could negotiate the changes in their articles that were needed by the censorship, and then their work was wired off to their papers. All right there. So they had really nice resources.
Almost not instant, but essentially
pretty close to instant, exactly. The women, by contrast, were mostly entirely kept well behind the scenes in the early parts of the Normandy invasion and all the time until before Paris. They were not allowed, not provided jeeps. They were not allowed at the press camps. The excuse the military used was there were no women's latrines there, and they weren't about to start digging them now. But in fact, the press camps were generally in very nice chateaus and in Paris in a five-star hotels.